Welcome to another episode of Friends in Wonder, a place where we invite you to explore meaningful topics without judgment or limits.
Brought to you by two lifelong friends sharing their insights while wondering, how can this help?
I'm Joe Luther.
And I'm Vince Kern.
And we've got great topics lined up for you each week. So be sure to subscribe, like, and even share with your friends.
Now let's wander and wonder together. How are your holidays going? It's that time of year, right?
Yeah. And for me, and I guess today's topic is going to cover a lot of that. But for me, it's a matter of how much I'm going to let my head get cluttered up with to-do lists and how much I'm going to let my own personal drill sergeant take over and interfere with the joy of the holidays. But I'm doing a pretty good job so far.
Sounds like you're preparing to keep yourself out of your own head.
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. And as much as we, try, it's not always easy, is it? And it can quickly devolve into being a motivator of getting things done to this drill sergeant that's lambasting us for not getting enough done. And I think that's the real rub, is what, keeping a balance.
Yeah. Well, I think staying outside of one's head is always a challenge. We get into this negative self-talk routine at a young age. A lot of times we make agreements at a young age that, we're not good enough, or we've got to accomplish all these tasks to get the reward, and that kind of becomes a way of life. And so this topic today, we thought we wanted to talk a little bit about that before the holidays, because we both have a lot of experience with negative self-talk, right? And
right, exactly. And it's not just negative self-talk, because that's kind of a it's a phrase probably that needs a little definition, but it's when it leads to anxiety or even depression, as our guest is going to talk about, that this stuff going on in our heads is not always productive. And too many people think that it's okay to be hard on self because you get stuff done.
Yeah.
I know that's, like you said, in my childhood, I did the same thing because I had a lot going in my childhood. I don't want to get into that rabbit hole now, but it wasn't always a pleasant home environment. And the way I found to make myself safe was to get in my head and to figure things out and to be sure that I'm not doing anything that's going to cause a spotlight to be on me and to get in trouble. So that became a loop in my brain of how to stay safe, or how to keep attention off of me so that I could, be safe. And so what's interesting is the holidays, I think, can exacerbate that, and that's why we decided to talk about this today.
Yeah, and you said it's a broad topic, and you know me, I like to define things. So I went out and looked and said, ask Google, what is negative self-talk? And just sort of as a setup to our interview guest, who is going to talk a lot about, he's got some tools how to help ourselves stay out of our own head. And he's got a great brand, which in fact is called Get Out of Your Head. He's written a couple books, but we'll get into that a little bit later. The Mayo Clinic gave me 4 definitions of what negative self-talk is, and just want to mention those briefly. And one of them is personalizing. For instance, a modern day example is, oh, they didn't respond to my text right away, so they must be mad at me. Filtering, and that's about amplifying negative effects. So you filter out the positive. So, let's say you go over your budget by $50, you might be caught up on that and not focus on the fact that you actually saved $200 somewhere else. So, catastrophizing. This is one I got to hold my hand up for. I'm automatically assuming the worst. It's like, oh, that fear-based, what's going to happen, and so on the way out of the office, for instance, the train gets stopped underground, and you immediately assume that you'll be stuck there for hours. And I had that experience in New York many times. Don't know when I'm going to get home. The last one is polarizing. You see things either as good or bad. There's no middle ground. You feel like you've got to be perfect or you're a total failure. And again, I hold that one up as I think those last two are the ones that I'm guilty of the most. And so as we walk through this, as we walk through life, we learn to deal with this stuff. And, one of the interesting things about our guest is he's not a clinician. Sometimes, all we need is a little refresher, a little reminder. And this young guy, his mission, he's probably in his mid 30s, and his mission is to help others just based on his own personal experience. And so I think you mentioned in the green room, Joe, you were talking about levels of anxiety and depression, and you made some good points about that.
Well, it's just this idea that we have anxiety, and there can be debilitating anxiety, and there can be the kind that just interferes with your enjoyment in life. And the same thing is true with depression, right? There can be depression that, is so bad that you can't even get out of bed in the morning. And then there's depression that just kind of lingers with you all day long. And you look like a guy who's grumpy. So there's different levels. And I think everybody experiences some of that at some point. And that's what's great about today's guest is he's going to help us recognize it and help give us some tools and techniques to improve on that in our own minds, in our own heads.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's just bringing awareness to what we're thinking, how we're thinking, and being aware of it and helping us get back into the moment. So I think we're ready to talk to our guest today. I'd like to
I'm excited
bring
to get
him in. If Al can push the button and get us rolling on that, we'll be in good shape.
All right.
So now let me introduce our guest for today. His name is Brian Sachetta, and he's the author and owner of Get Out of Your Head, a brand and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. By trade, Brian is a software developer, and he combines his experiences in the tech world with previous mental health battles to draw parallels between computer systems and the human mind and give readers practical strategies for evading their own psychological demons. Brian currently has 2 books on the market: Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety, and Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. His mission is to help as many sufferers as possible through not only those books, but also his blog and podcast experiences. Welcome, Brian. It's great to have you on the show today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Vince and Joe.
Hi, Brian.
Yeah, so you're Get Out of Your Head. That's a great name for a brand. Can you tell us a little bit about your mission there at getoutofyourhead.com?
Yeah, for sure. Kind of as you alluded to already, it's really just to help folks that are suffering with anxiety and depression. So that's the base case, right? And then it's like, how do I go and kind of pursue that mission? So right now it's a couple of the books, the ones that you mentioned, writing blog posts, getting on podcast appearances like this one. It's really just trying to provide as much information as I can to fellow sufferers in hopes of, making the journey a little bit easier for them.
And you also do some direct coaching as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. That's sort of my attempt at helping people distill the information that I talk about in my writings and apply it in their own lives. I always want to be a little bit careful when I talk about the coaching, in the sense that, like, I am not a clinician. I'm not a licensed therapist. So this is not therapy. It's more, a conversation with a good friend and somebody who has this different content that we can sort of try to apply to a specific person's life, right? I always say that if you read one of the books and you say, hey, well, this was good, but at the same time, like, you talked about concept X, Y, and Z, how does that apply to this specific situation that I'm dealing with? That is sort of one of the goals of the coaching is being able to say, we are now custom tailoring this stuff for you, rather than the book that has to be a little bit more generic, right? Because it's going to fit a specific market rather than a specific person.
Mm-hmm. And now, is all of that one-on-one, or do you also work with groups?
Yeah, right now it's just one-on-one. I know that some people do have, group coaching efforts. It's not something that I've really thought about, looked into. I wouldn't say that I'm closed off to it, but at the moment, it's just not something that I pursue.
Yeah, it's a very personal thing when you're talking about that type of dynamic, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because it's like, on the one hand, it is very personal, and I think we sometimes want to and need to keep things confidential. On the other hand, I think that going into sort of a larger thread here, right, is like, so many of us suffer in silence, or at least suffer by ourselves. And even though I don't do group therapy or group coaching or anything like that, there could be an argument there, right, to say, hey, if we got a bunch of people in the room to discuss some of the things that they've been going through, then we have this bridge now where it's like, oh, I'm not the only person in the world who deals with this sort of thing. I think that can be pretty helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Brian. So today's talk is about negative self-talk, and obviously getting out of your head is a big part of, dealing with that. I know in my introduction, our introduction, I was recounting some of my own personal experiences with negative self-talk. What is your definition of self-talk? And what, I guess, along with what do you think it is, what do you think the toxic or consequences are of having that going on in your head?
Sure. So I think there's a couple ways that we can approach this, right? I think the first is the larger, more generic answer to the question. So it's like, what is negative self-talk, right? Just in our lives, it is basically us talking to ourselves in ways that are disempowering. So whether that's, thinking that bad things are going to happen, talking down to ourselves, lambasting ourselves, or whatever it is, saying you're not good enough, you didn't try hard enough, something like that. That is, in general, that is sort of the, negative self-talk umbrella. I think as it pertains to the work that I do, I like to focus it on anxiety and depression, right? So it's like, what are the thoughts, the beliefs, the patterns that we go through in our minds that lead us to feel anxious, to feel depressed? I think we will probably get into this further in the interview, but it's like, negative self-talk can be a good thing sometimes. It can also be a bad thing. I would say more often than not, it's a bad thing. But it's like, when it comes to anxiety and depression, we're talking about the bad side, right? In terms of the good, just a very quick preview, right? It's like, if I'm sitting in bed all day and I haven't done anything, and I know I need to get up and do something, if I say to myself, like, dude, get out of bed, you lazy bum, or whatever, it's possible that inspires me to get out of bed. And so that is negative self-talk, but at the same time, it may motivate me to do something. So I think probably a lot of what we'll focus on in this conversation is the negative self-talk that disempowers us, doesn't help us, that sort of thing.
Right. It's kind of like there's a fine line between negative self-talk and having a moral compass, or negative self-talk and just being, motivating yourself.
Sure. And I think one thing to add there, right, is like, even though motivating ourselves with that kind of talk can help us, maybe I would say there's probably a better way to do it than that. But, it's a sliding scale. It's this gradient of like, okay, on one side, we've got the bad kind of self-talk. In the middle, we've got, something that helps us, but maybe it's not as sustainable because it's negative. We want those strategies that are sustainable, to be able to say, like, rather than negative self-talk that motivates, we may want to say, look, I'm tired right now. I get it, but I need to do this for my family. I need to do this for my future, my career, something like that. I don't think we'll probably cover that kind of talk too much in this discussion, but I think just covering that gradient can be helpful.
It's interesting because negative self-talk is sort of could be called a foundation of anxiety and depression in some ways. And you've dealt with a lot of people and helping and talking through these things. Do you feel that is it pervasive in today's culture? Do you see it? How pervasive do you think it is? And another thing we wanted to talk about, it's the holiday season too. And isn't this sort of is this a better time for people to negative self-talk? And I use better in quotes, obviously.
More fertile.
So, yeah, more fertile. Right.
Got it. Yeah. So, I was thinking about this, and I think there's a couple ways to answer it. And I want to make sure that I do answer it. I may go off on a little bit of a tangent, but so if you think about human psychology, evolution in general, right? We talk about the brain's negativity bias, the sort of the inclination for us to think about or react to negative stimuli before we think about or react to positive stimuli, things that could make us feel good. There's a reason for that, right? It's like hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were, in small tribes out in the wild, if we didn't react to the fact that there was a tiger in front of us, we'd be dead. Our ancestors would be dead, all that sort of thing. So there is a benefit to, thinking about negative things. And I think that pretty much everybody probably has some piece of that inside themselves. There's a lot of science around the negativity bias and how we think, I want to say it's like 60,000 thoughts a day. And maybe the ratio is like 5-to-1 of negative to positive or something like that. So I think everybody has that tendency, in their DNA. At the same time, right, this is sort of the nurture versus nature argument. So that's the nurture, that's the nature piece. And then the nurture piece is a little bit more of the society that we live in, the home that we were brought up in, that sort of thing. I think that in America, you can definitely make the argument that we are more of an individualistic culture. And so that means that we tend to look, we tend to think about ourselves more often, look at our problems, look at what's going on inside of us more so than some other cultures, right? I'm not that good at, I don't know what the right term is for somebody who studies cultures, but I am not one of those people. So I'll probably stumble a little bit here. But I think in general, right, if you look at, I'm just going to kind of throw a country out there again, apologies, I'm not that great at this. But if you look at a more collectivist culture, let's say Japan, right? People who are focused on the group, the community, the family, something like that, there's going to be less of a tendency for those folks to constantly engage in introspection, engage in, thinking about themselves, thinking about their problems. They're going to be more likely to think about the community. And so I think that, the long and short of the answer is, I think everybody has these tendencies, whether or not they are sort of propagated or helped along through society is probably a matter of where you grow up, how you grow up, that sort of thing. So I would say, again, I guess sort of cherry on top here, I would venture to say that in America, we deal with this more than some other cultures. But I also think that probably a lot of people deal with this.
Well, yeah. And I think maybe what Vince was getting at too is that because we as in the Western culture, it's probably true in all cultures, but especially in the more, modernized cultures, we tend to have bigger to-do lists. And it's just like what you were talking about going back, tens of thousands of years ago. There were probably less to-dos. They may have been more consequential ones. But we now, and especially during the holiday season, we tend to get this idea that we've got so much to do and that the only way to get it done is, to be a drill sergeant to ourselves. And I think that's kind of what maybe if Vince wasn't getting at, that's my follow-up question to it is our modern society a little bit more susceptible to being hard on self?
I do think there is something to that, right? In the sense that if you look at studies, if you just kind of talk about the social discourse and whatnot, it's like America is a stress-ridden country and a stress-ridden society. And so I think that from that perspective, right? If you boil down what that means, it's like we tend to be hard on ourselves. We tend to stack our calendars and our schedules. We tend to not make time for some of the things that could bring us some healing or at least some good feelings. And so I do think, I think it is a very, very broad question, or at least one that we could talk about for hours. I'm sure there's researchers that spend most of their lives thinking about this stuff. But my short answer to your question, Joe, is yes. I think that the I don't know, sort of the cultural practices in America sort of propagate that sort of thing.
So what do you think, maybe using the techniques that you advocate, what do you think people can do to maybe get out of their head with the negative self-talk?
Yeah, this one's tough because I think that negative self-talk, like it's again, a broad thing, right? There are definitely instances where we could say, hey, I realize right now that I am beating myself up over this specific thing. So if we start small, we may be able to create a practice for ourselves that then expands over into larger areas of our lives. But at the same time, it's one of those things where, sometimes in the self-help world, people will talk about limiting beliefs or something like that. And don't get me wrong, like I'm sure there are people out there who can change limiting beliefs quickly. At the same time though, right? It's like people say neurons that fire together, wire together. And we talk about, going all the way back in therapy through our childhood and all that sort of stuff. So it's like some of the patterns that we run in our heads, in our minds, those are deep, deep patterns that we've been perpetuating for years and years, right? So I think it's kind of tangenting a little bit from the original question, but I do think that it's difficult sometimes to stop negative thinking because of these, sort of our histories, if you will. That's why I think that it's important to more so look at specific situations and say, like, here's how I'm feeling right now. Maybe it's because of a specific stimulus. Here's how I'm reacting to that stimulus and talking to myself as a result. And then from there, we can kind of say, just working in this small box of what I'm dealing with right now, I can focus on the specific thoughts that are running through my head, rather than saying, I need to, in general, be somebody who doesn't engage in so much of the negative self-talk.
Yeah. And for our listeners, I should add that you've got a lot of great blog posts on your website that deal with some of the things that I think you just talked about. For instance, one of them is headlined Pattern Recognition, Fighting Despair with Awareness. It kind of sounds exactly what you were just talking about. And then you got another one called Memory Pointers, How Our Brains Trick Us into Even More Anxiety. And what I find fascinating is how you use the relationship between your technology expertise and thinking about these problems. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe that Memory Pointers one is a good example. I don't know, but share with us about that.
Yeah, so I'll give you just the general background there is basically like, as you alluded to in the intro, by trade, I'm a software developer. That means, 40, 50, whatever amount of hours per week I'm writing software, architecting different mobile apps and stuff like that. On nights and weekends, I'm working on the mental health stuff, writing books, writing blogs, working on my brand. I think that just by virtue of spending a lot of time in a specific domain, so the one that I'm referring to here is software development, you spend 40 hours a week on anything, that's inevitably going to bleed into other areas of your life, right? So let's just say I spend 20 hours a week on the, the get out of your head front. Because there's this overlap in like, okay, I'm spending a lot of time over here and a lot of time over here, and those two subjects tend to bleed into one another. All of a sudden, like over the years, I would come up with different ideas and say like, oh, what I'm dealing with right now feels to me similar to what I was dealing with at work last week, or, writing that specific software function or mobile app or something like that. So I was sort of saying earlier off stage that part of my brand is displaying this parallel between computer science or computer programs, computer systems, and how the human mind works. I also like to say that even though I do that, it's not really like a one-to-one overlap, right? It's sort of more just like, hey, these are some of the parallels that I found, given the fact that I spend so much time in these two domains. At the same time, I wouldn't talk about computer science in the mental health world if I didn't think there was legitimate overlap that was helpful for folks. So, to give an example, right? In software development, there's this term called recursion, which is basically where a block of code calls itself. And so there's another term that people talk about, which is an infinite loop. So basically, that would be the concept of that block of code calling itself an infinite amount of times, or basically so many times in a row that the computer that's running that block of code would basically say, like, I think something's amiss here, right? And so when we're writing our code, it's very possible that like we're writing some function that says or lends itself to being called 100,000 times, 10,000 times, something like that. But at the end of the day, if we want our software to actually run correctly, we're going to need some base case in that continuous block of code, that infinite loop that eventually says, hey, I've met this specific condition, so I'm going to break out of this thing. And that is this is just one specific example that I like to talk about in some of the writings, which is basically, the anxiety that goes on in our minds can sometimes become recursive, in the sense that we start by being anxious over some specific thing. And then all of a sudden we beat ourselves up for being anxious. And then we're anxious about being anxious, and then so on and so on and so forth, right? And so just like a computer program or a software function needs a base case to say, I've identified this specific thing, and that is sort of the flag that says break out of this infinite loop. We need that same sort of thing. So it's basically the awareness to say, I realize that my anxiety is becoming recursive, or I am chewing over this same thing again and again and again and not getting anywhere. Once we have that awareness to make that conclusion, we can then bring in some of our favorite, distraction strategies that then, what's the right word, sort of quote unquote, breaks us out of that infinite loop.
Mm-hmm. Gets us thinking in another direction. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of those strategies.
Yeah, sure. So one thing that I like to do in introducing this sort of thing is basically say, so in my first book, the first half of that book, I talk about when we are already fearful over a specific situation. I want to help folks get out of that fear, walk that fear back, right? So I present them with a framework that I call the 10 steps to getting out of your head. Those are 10 specific strategies that folks can enlist to do that very thing. We can talk about some of those things, but also like, just because I present 10 doesn't necessarily mean that there are only 10, right? It's sort of like, those were the 10 that I came up with when I wrote the book. They came to me during a specific experience in my life. But if we were to talk about some of them, right? It's like, they don't have to be all that complicated. We could go for a walk down the hallway. We could listen to our favorite song. We could do some deep breathing, like into our bellies and try to use our physiology to get out of our minds. We could go to the gym. We could go running. We could call a friend, something like that. I think the only one that I listed there that is in the that framework that I mentioned would be the first one, and that's to breathe. I think the specific thing there that is important to talk about is the fact that when we are in an anxious state, I want to make sure that I kind of frame this the right way, but don't go too far down the path. Basically, right? So we've got like our fight or flight nervous systems, and so that would be called the sympathetic nervous system, and then we have sort of the other side of that coin, which is our parasympathetic nervous system. That's the part of our autonomic nervous system that's responsible for getting us back to calm. And so when we are anxious, more often than not, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, is revved up really high, right? In order to get that system to turn off, or for the parasympathetic nervous system to activate, we need to breathe. We need to breathe. Specifically, we need to breathe deeply, both deeply, and we need to breathe out deeply. And so it's like being able to have the awareness to say, I'm in my head right now, I'm going to do some deep breathing. That can actually create a big change in our physiology, which then all of a sudden it's like, because our bodies aren't moving at 1,000,000 miles a minute anymore, all of a sudden we can then, like it's almost as if this sort of trickle down effect, I guess, propagates down to our minds, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, like, the neurotransmitters, the hormones aren't flying through my brain anymore. I feel a little bit better. I don't feel the urge to necessarily chew these things over so much. And I think
that's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think deep breathing is a great one. And I tend to do that. I think just intuitively, that sometimes when things just get a little out of control, you take a nice, deep, peaceful, and concentrated breath, and you can reset. But I guess the other part of it is recognizing that you're involved in this loop, or that you're involved in this toxic negative thought that's going on. But once you do that, you take a deep breath, which is in effect, like you said earlier, a form of nurturing, which is probably the opposite of negative self-talk, right? It's a little bit of coddling to self, and that deep breathing feels like that sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I do think sort of an interesting coda there is basically that the most difficult part, I think, at least, from my experience and folks that I talk to, I think the most difficult part is that awareness, right? Because so much of this, brain activity happens on the subconscious level, where it's like 30 minutes can go by of us ruminating over specific things before we even get to the part of understanding and having that awareness that we are doing that specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the strategies might be the easy part, right? If we have them written down, if we have them at hand, whatever, it's like, oh, we do some deep breathing. But in order to get us to first engage in those things, that's the tricky part. And it's like, I have some strategies for that, but I think a lot of it is basically just sort of understanding that we are this instrument, right? It's almost like you're the pilot of the airplane. You got to, hit some knobs, turn some levers, whatever it is. Eventually you realize like, okay, I understand the system is in this state. I understand the system is in that state. And it takes that real world experience of going through some of these feelings before you can finally cultivate that awareness, either on demand or at least in short order.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very experiential. I heard somewhere recently where they said 4 deep breaths with the in through the nose and fill up the lungs as much as possible. And then the 4 exhales, that's what it takes to reset. Now, hey, some people, who knows, but I heard that.
I can do it. I can do it in one.
Joe can do it in one. He's well practiced.
Yeah. And it's like, I think having some number is great, but at the end of the day, it's like as long as it helps us, right?
Yeah,
I don't
right.
care. I don't care if it's 1,
Recognize.
2, 3,
Yeah, it
4.
might take
just,
12 some
Yeah.
days. Right.
It's
Exactly.
just
As long
understanding
as you're doing
that, that strategy could help us. And the other thing about that, right, is like sometimes it serves as its own distractions sort of tactic, right? Where it's like, if we think it's four breaths that it's going to take, us being able to say to ourselves, like, okay, breath 1, breath 2, and so on and so forth, that can then allow us to focus on that breathing and not focus on all the things that are going on in our minds.
That's a great point. I didn't think of it that way, but that explains it even deeper.
It's kind of like, I think in one of your blogs that I read, there was some discussion of kind of living in the now and the importance of being in the now, which is a very near and dear topic to Vince's and my hearts, because we're huge fans of Eckhart Tolle. And I guess that's part of it, because when your mind is always anticipating negative things and thinking ahead and not being in the present moment, which is what really a deep breath can help you to get back to. That's when I think we get our brains out of control, and we're not, like you say, recognizing that we're the pilots of this system.
Hey, in August, you published a great blog post called "Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Is this thought helpful?" And that really resonates with Joe and I, because one of the DNAs of our show is we try to always come from that lens of, is this helpful? Whatever it is we're talking about. And so I wonder if you can describe a little bit about what you're calling acceptance and commitment therapy, and talk about that a little bit.
And
Yeah.
is that kind of like the opposite of negative self-talk, acceptance? Or
I mean, there's definitely some forces there that are at odds with each other in a good sense, right? Where it's like, if we were to engage in ACT, that would be beneficial for us. I don't know if they necessarily are like one-to-one opposites of each other, but the general idea, right? So I think probably folks that are listening have probably heard of something like CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's an approach for our mental health that doesn't necessarily involve, going to the doctor. Like maybe you work out CBT in a doctor's office, but like you can also, once you have its principles down, you can work with it yourself. It doesn't involve medication or anything like that. And one of the things that I like to say, and I will definitely answer the actual question in a second, but one of the reasons I look at some of these frameworks is the fact that, like, because I'm not a licensed clinician and I can't diagnose, I can't treat, I just can't bring medication into the discussion, right? Something like that. So it's like, I'm looking at some of these therapies, if you will, like we'll call them that, especially when they have that word in the name itself, just to try to be able to bring some more support, some more help to readers, to listeners, to my audience, that sort of thing. So ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, it's basically just a new, different approach to mental well-being and supporting our own psychological endeavors. So basically, like if we look at the term itself, right, there's two parts to it. So it's like acceptance is basically being able to get to a point with ourselves where we are okay with either what is going on in our minds, what is going on in our lives, who we are as people, something like that. And then the second part of that is of ACT is the commitment part. So it's like, once we have accepted certain truths that like we don't think we can necessarily change, we commit to changing the things that we can change. So as it applies to, obviously that's super high level, so it's like, as it applies to anxiety, that may be saying, I understand and I accept the fact that my body gets revved up in these specific situations. I accept the fact that I get fearful when I go on job interviews. Again, those are examples. It could be a whole host of things that we talk about. The commitment piece would be saying, even though I get anxious during these situations, I understand that I run certain patterns in my mind. I perpetuate the things that I'm feeling through the things that I do with my body, with my brain, with my psychology, that sort of thing. And then sort of following up with that, the commitment piece is like saying to ourselves, I commit to the fact that I am going to try to change the things that I can change in this situation. It's a little bit like the Serenity Prayer, if you guys are familiar with that,
that's
right?
What it sounded like, yeah.
Yeah. And so the last piece that I tied in there, so there's this question that comes up in some places where you talk about ACT, which is basically like the question of, is this thought helpful? And I think one of the things, I deal with, I struggle with, a lot of people struggle with, is the notion that if a thought pops into our minds, like we have to confront it. We have to think about it. We have to chew it over. Sometimes, I talk about this in my first book, which is basically like, there have been times in my life, and I used to do it for years, which was basically sort of this like, I'm trying to find the right adjective for it, but it's like sort of this like inflated sense of self sort of thing, where it's like basically a thought comes into my mind and I say like, and maybe it's not a self, but maybe it's an inflated sense of the value of thoughts, right? And saying like, this thought came to me, and because it's related to a specific thing, or it feels as though it's scary, important, whatever, the universe is sending me some kind of sign, right? Like I need to prepare for whatever it is that thought is alluding to, or whatever. I think the more research you do, the more you dive into things that we talked about earlier, the negativity bias, the amount of thoughts we have on a daily basis, you realize that like we have, again, 60,000 thoughts a day. Maybe some of those are repetitive. And so it's like maybe 30,000 of them are related to this scary thing that we have to go do tomorrow. And so by virtue of the fact that so many of those kinds of thoughts are hitting our brains, we may say to ourselves, this is a sign that I need to go do X, Y, Z. I need to chew this situation over, think over every last detail, pre-plan every last piece of it. The question of, is this helpful, is a piece, it's sort of a therapy piece in itself of saying, giving ourselves permission to answer that question and say, is this thing helpful or is it not? And then say, if it's not helpful, we need to just move on. We need to drop the idea that, these thoughts have this monumental impact. They are sort of like, they almost come with this like sort of fate component of like, oh, this is the most important thing in my life, or if I don't do X, Y, Z, certain things will happen. And that comes with experience too, right? Is, after spending however many years with these negative thoughts, being able to say to ourselves like, yeah, I spent, all those years chewing over all these things. Some of the things I worried about manifested themselves. Some of them didn't. And being able to just poke holes in the belief, right? And then eventually you get to the point where you say, you know what? I know that it's scary. Again, kind of going back to the acceptance and commitment piece of the framework is saying, I know that these thoughts are scary and I know that they're hard to put down. I may not necessarily always have control over the fact that they will pop into my mind. But what I do have control over, or at least some influence over, is that decision in saying, those thoughts are here. I am going to do my best to look away from them. I'm going to, leverage some sort of distraction related strategy, methodology, whatever it may be, to strip myself of the feelings that are evoked when I chew over those specific kinds of thoughts. So that's basically what I was talking about in that blog post in a nutshell. And I feel like you guys probably have some questions. So why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm raising my hand about, thinking back about all the time that you spend wasting, with the negative self thoughts. I'm also, I'm 62, and I would say that it probably took me until maybe 10 years ago before I could even consistently practice kind of what you're talking about. And I think everybody has good times with that. And I does that seem to flex with people? I mean, how do you see that as being something that people are going to have to, deal with on a regular thing, or can it actually sort of be eliminated? Is it always there, or is it something we just have to walk through?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this stuff, this is an important nuance to provide, is I think all of this stuff is difficult, right? I don't write my books, I don't write my blog posts from like my ivory tower being like, oh, I've, vanquished anxiety and depression, whatever. It's kind of me just talking about my experiences and trying to provide some hope and solace to folks and being able to tell them like, things can get better and they probably will. At the same time, like this is a challenging subject, right? I think a lot of folks struggle with mental illness, anxiety, depression, whatever it may be. And to answer your question of like, can we eliminate negative self-talk or do we really just kind of minimize it? I think that it's it's a skill, right? And it's like with any skill, we have to practice it. And so it's like, I think the good news is it's not like we necessarily have to go to our tool shed or to the gym or whatever it is, right? And focus on and hone this craft. Our thoughts are always with us. So if we really wanted to, every moment of the day presents an opportunity for us to work on this skill. And sometimes it's a little bit easier than others, right? It's like if we have already integrated a specific strategy into our lives, into our routines, then when a negative thought pops into our heads, it's possible that we may just deflect it, right, and move on. I think the challenging thing is that in life, there are so many different kinds of thoughts that sort of present themselves in different fashions, even if they are that same underlying negative kind of self-talk. There are so many different situations that will present themselves in our lives where it's like, okay, well, I thought I was just dealing with this one specific kind of anxiety or whatever it is. And then it's like, oh, I got nervous about, stepping on stage and giving a speech. I got nervous about going to teacher parent night at the school. I got nervous about, asking that person out that I was interested in or whatever. And so it's like the same sort of, I guess, the underlying concept of negative self-talk and anxiety, depression, whatever it is, those things can appear in a myriad of different ways in our lives. And so it's like, we have to almost go through a lot of those different experiences in order to feel competent in approaching those things. And that takes time, right? So I think that eventually we can definitely get to a point where we minimize these things and we say, you know what, I have changed my psychological patterns. I have changed the underlying beliefs in my mind that say, when this happens, I need to do this, or I am this kind of person. Those things go a very long way. But at the same time, as I also alluded to earlier in the conversation, it's like some of these things cut really deep too, right? A lot of the patterns that we run are like tracks in our minds that have been, grooved over for years and years and years, maybe patterns that we developed as protection mechanisms when we were children. And so I guess the degree or the amount of practice that we need to do is sort of varies for every single person. And sometimes it takes time. But I do think in the long run, I do think we can get to a point where we feel competent that we are able to minimize these thoughts in our mind and then minimize the feelings that come alongside them.
Yeah. And I was going to say, what I find helpful is once you recognize that you're doing that and you fundamentally understand that there are many ways to be productive. Just like if you're going to encourage a child to do something, you can do it with screaming and yelling at them, or you can do it with positive talk. Most anybody, if they see a parent yelling at a young child, cringe, right? But if we're doing that to ourselves, we should be cringing as well, because there are other ways to motivate ourselves besides with, this kind of toxic negative thought. And we can do it with nurture as well. And, or if we do slip into that bad habit of getting after ourselves, recognize it and then give a little bit of nurture. And like we talked about, a deep breath, or it can just be, kind of, I sometimes picture myself as a child and giving myself kind of a little hug. And I know it sounds maybe a little silly, but it really does work. Like, it's this idea of nurturing self, because if you've got somebody who's riding you all day long, that's not a good thing. Well, if it's yourself, there's something you can do about it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I really like that sort of metaphor or tactic that you gave there, Joe, which was, picturing yourself as a kid and giving yourself a hug. I think to kind of bring up a slightly different topic, right? Especially as men, I think mental health can be challenging in the sense that, one, we don't want to talk. Most people don't want to talk about these things. We don't want to expose our vulnerability, expose our emotions. At the same time, right? It's like, as a dude and somebody who solves problems and challenges, it's like, I kind of look at it in a different sense of like, you get to the point where you have experienced so much pain that you are willing to drop the sort of machismo, right? And you're like, you know what? If what it takes is me giving myself a mental hug from the younger version of myself or something like that, who cares, right? It's right. Like, I need to confront this thing, and then I need to figure out a way to get on with my life.
Yeah, and that gets into something that I was telling Joe about earlier. We were talking about some of our history with negative self-talk, and you always think about it as being towards yourself, but there's definite ramifications for the people around you when you're stuck in that loop, right? And Do you see that? And how do you talk about that with your clients?
Somebody who engages in perpetual and a lot of negative self-talk, sometimes it's like a defense mechanism, right? Where it's like we are holding other people at bay, at arm's length or whatever, where it's like, before anybody can jump on me, I'm going to jump on myself. I think I'm trying to answer the question, by bridging the two things, right? It's basically like, if that is our strategy, one of the downsides of that tactic is the fact that, hey, maybe other people have feedback for us that would be helpful, that we could then integrate and change our approach with. If we are constantly jumping out in front and saying, hey, I'm beating myself up, I'm doing this, whatever, it's possible that those people won't give us that feedback, and then we won't be able to change.
Hey, Brian, I do have one final kind of funny question, especially knowing what your background is. They keep talking about computers getting more and more and more advanced, and at some point, possibly they could even become conscious. I don't know what your thoughts are on the idea of computers becoming conscious, but if they do you think that they'll be guilty of having negative self-talk?
I liked it was sort of a diversion there, right? I was like, oh, well, and I can talk about kind of both sides.
Actually, I think you talk about another podcast. We could talk about computers becoming conscious on another podcast, but I think they probably will need therapists if they do.
Hey, that would put some people in jobs, and that would be good, because one of the concerns, right, is that the robots will come for all of our jobs. So if they need therapists, then maybe a lot of us will go to school for that sort of thing.
We don't need angry robots out there, that's for sure.
It's definitely a good cartoon strip that you could make there.
So, Brian, you've got 2 books out there. Again, can you give us the titles of those books again, and where people can find you if they are interested in finding out more about you?
Yeah. So the first one is Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. As you can tell by the title there, that one is focused on anxiety and nervousness. The second book is called Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. I think you'll probably find, or somebody would find if they were to grab both books, right? It's the same author. It's the same kind of approach. But the reason why there's 2 books, and the reason why for the distinction is they are divided along the lines of the 2 diseases. And I wanted to give each one of them their space. And then in terms of, finding myself, finding my books, if you go to getoutofyourhead.com, so that URL is all one word, no dashes, no spaces in there. You can find the books, you can find my blog, you can grab some merch if you want to.
I love your merch. I was looking at your merch. That's a great brand. Get Out of Your Head. I mean, if nothing else, that's what people need to know, right? Get out of your head.
Yeah, well, my designer did a very good job, and thanks for the compliments. I'll definitely pass them along to him. And then, in terms of finding the books, like I said, you can find them on the website. But if you did want to go directly to Amazon, you could find them as well. I should note that, like, you may want to type my name into Amazon. There is a different Get Out of Your Head out there that causes some confusion on the market. So just make sure you find mine.
Well, getoutofyourhead.com will get it done.
Yeah, Brian Sachetta, getoutofyourhead.com. It's been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you today. You've really helped us learn a lot more, and I'm sure there are people out there who feel the same way.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. It was a lot of fun.
Likewise. Thank you, guys.
Wow, Joe, that was a great guest. Wouldn't you say?
I think we got to give ourselves a pat on the back for that too, Vince, because that was a great interview. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot.
Yeah, finding Brian was really like, finding a huge gold vein somewhere. He's somebody who's younger. He's somebody who has a lot of experience with this issue, and his book is absolutely fabulous. I've read it, and I would encourage anyone who's looking for a great refresher, non-clinical toolkit to look at his website and get a hold of his book. The book really talks about where anxiety comes from and how to stop perpetuating it. He gives you 10 great steps for mitigating anxiety during stressful situations. He talks about how to leverage fear into a vehicle for personal growth, which is, that experiential learning that we all need to do, and how to stop fighting yourself and start living again. And, it's just a great practical toolkit book. And he's got two of them out there. Again, the title of his book by Brian Sachetta is Get Out of Your Head, a Toolkit for Living with and Overcoming Anxiety.
Yeah. And what I liked about him is it's about self-empowerment, right? It's not about going and seeking help and going back and forth to the therapist. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's other ways to do it too. And his book is about self-empowerment. And like we discussed in the interview, we have so many thoughts a day. Like I think he said 60,000 of them a day, and a majority of them can be negative.
Yeah.
And so developing strategies to deal with those, as he said, having the strategies is the easy part, but recognizing the patterns and then using those strategies, the one that we talked about the most was breathing deep and just cleansing yourself and resetting yourself. That's what I love about
tool.
Yeah, self-empowerment. We can do this. We can do this ourselves. Anyhow, what a great interview, Vince, and what a timely topic at this time of year.
Yeah, so true, Joe. And you know what? It is the holiday time, so I wish you the best of luck in your preparations and staying out of your own head. And I know that, this is a challenge for everybody. So we want you to know that we're sending our energy to you to do the same thing. And we wish you a smooth, peaceful, out of your head holiday.
Enjoy the moment.